What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another 3D model. This week, we're going to be making a hovercraft. And this hovercraft is actually based off the video game Far Cry 6. I came across this image online a while back and I've been wanting to make this hovercraft for quite some time now. So I thought this week would be a perfect opportunity to do that. Now, I don't have a lot of references when it comes to this specific hovercraft. I did look online and I came across this other image, which gives a different perspective of the inside and the back components. But for all the other things, we're gonna have to experiment and get creative a little bit and just kind of create our own objects to fit into this model. Now, we also don't have a lot of time. I am doing this on my weekends, so we're gonna try to get all the modeling and UVing done in one day. And then on Sunday, the next day, we're gonna do all of the texturing and the rendering. So that really doesn't leave us a lot of time for this model, so let's just dive into it and start blocking out some shapes. Now, don't forget, you can find this full video in real time along with all the working files, and the real-time video also includes the full UV mapping process. So if that's something you're interested in getting access to, you can find that all on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. So I wanted to do something a little bit different for this week's video. Most of the time I am rushing through these videos, so I just usually create one high poly or mid poly model. But for this week, I decided to do something a little bit different. I wanted to create a more game ready asset, which means I need to create two meshes. One low poly model that's a bit more optimized for a game engine, and one high poly model that we can create our texture maps with. So we're basically going to start with one low poly model, relatively low poly model. Obviously there's lots of components and objects, so I don't have any specific poly count that I'm working towards, but we are going to aim for a relatively lower poly mesh. And then once that's complete and we UV map that lower poly model, we can then subdivide that model to create some smooth curvature and add a bit more detail. So this video will take a little bit longer than usual, but I thought it'd be fun to do something a little bit different. So like every model, I'm going to start with blocking out those main shapes. Of course, starting off with the biggest hull shape of this hovercraft, then we can start adding a bit more detail and adding other components to it. Now, it's always important to not rush out the blockout stage. It's more difficult to come back and rework things than just take your time and be happy with the initial blockout, and then we can start moving on to more fun things. Now, I just really quickly wanted to mention one quick thing. Since we are trying to get through the modeling and the UVing in one day, I am going to have to simplify a few of these shapes. But of course, the more time you spend on this model, the better quality and the better mesh you will have in the end. So that's something I just wanted to point out, is really take your time, don't rush things. There's a lot of other details I wish I could have added, like a lot more controls on the dashboard and different gauges, but I just simply didn't have enough time. So just something I wanted to point out, take your time and make sure you're happy with the model before you move on to other things. All right, enough of me talking. Let's continue blocking out some of these shapes and let's slowly piece together our hovercraft. Alright, so before we jump into those UVs, I just quickly want to give a shout out to this week's video sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay offers a variety of services ranging from PCB production, sheet metal fabrication, injection molding, 3D printing, and much more. You can quickly upload your own files and get a quote immediately, so if you're building something at home or want to print one of your own 3D models, PCBWay makes it extremely easy to get custom parts for your projects, even if you don't have the necessary tools. They take care of everything so you can get those parts shipped directly to your front door. So if you're working on a project or need 3D printing or any of these other services, make sure to check them out in the description below. And once again, thank you PCBWay for sponsoring this week's video. Alright, so here is the Hovercraft in its finished form. Now everything is basically the exact same. I went ahead and just duplicated the models that were on one side to the other. That way they can share the same UV space. And there's no point having two different UV shells for two different poles when they can share the same UV space, because you're never going to really see the repeating pattern on this pole on this one. So all these handles, for example, this light, I just went ahead and duplicated, and same with this stuff, just went ahead and duplicated them over so they're all sharing the same UV space. Other than that, everything is basically the exact same. I did add this tiny rope at the last minute. I just wanted to add something unique on this side of the Hovercraft. But like I said, there's lots more I wish I could have added if I had more time. I just ran out of time, so I just decided to go with this. Basically the dash, I really actually wish I added a lot more controls. I feel like we could have done something cooler, but like I said, time is always an issue. Now, before we get started, I just really quickly wanted to talk about optimization and performance. It's really important when you're making a video game asset to talk to your art team or your art director or your art lead to figure out your performance constraints. Where is the model being used? How is it being used? This is usually something you talk about before you start modeling. So for example, is it a hero prop? Is it a background prop? Is it being used in a mobile game? Is it being used in Unreal Engine? All of this can drastically change your approach with how you actually make these models. Now, I did say that this is going to be a video game asset. So when I was thinking about this, I'm most familiar with Unreal Engine. So I was assuming that this would go into an engine like that. So poly count wasn't, I mean, it always is important, but not as important as something like a mobile game. But also what's very important are texture amounts. The more textures you have, the more draw calls you're going to make, and that's going to really affect performance when you have tons of assets in your scene. Now, Unreal Engine does a great job when it comes to polys because it has nanite and can really handle really high poly meshes very well, where other game engines don't handle them so well. So this is all something you need to figure out before you actually approach your models. So what I decided to do with my low poly mesh was add 3 different textures. Now 3, to be honest with you, is a little bit high. I probably would have combined some of these. So if you look, the very first group is just the main hull. The second is the seat and some of these components. And the third is the back, both motors and the back fan. Now I feel like I could have split these two probably into one, or taken some of the objects from my second group and combined them into the other two just to kind of split them up. That way I could have had only 2 textures for this model, which I think would be something a little bit better for a model this big. But like I said, I was really running out of time on my UV mapping. It was the end of the day, so I decided to simplify it and just kind of break them up into 3 different groups. But it is something important that I wanted to talk about really quickly. So let's go over these UVs. The very first group is, like I said, the main hull. Now, of course, it's important to try to maximize your UV space. So try to have as little empty space as possible. This is actually a little bit of a wasted space. Like I said, there's not too many components in this group, so I feel like I could have added more from these second group or the third, but it is what it is. Now, besides obviously filling in the empty space, it's important to keep your shell straight. Not only is that just going to help applying materials and avoid having any weird warping or aliasing, but it's also going to help you fit these shells tighter together. And the second group and texture is basically the whole inside component, the seat and controls, as well as the bottom hull. Now, something really important I wanted to go over was, I know people always bring up textile density, and textile density is important. That's something as well you should talk about your team, depending on what textile density you're aiming for, if you are aiming for anything. But what I like to do sometimes when I'm creating my own models is enlarge the shells that are more important. So for example, if you look at these 3 gauges, I wanted to add a gauge pattern to them. So it was important for me to actually make those a little bit bigger because if they were very small in my UV map, they would have very little pixels to work with and they would probably look very pixelated and not detailed. Now, if I just made all of these texel densities the same, so let's say I highlighted all of these shells and laid them out, Maya will automatically give them the same texel density. But as you can see, it's going to make a lot of these shells very, very small to compensate for this large bottom piece that I have. Now, of course, but on paper, that sounds nice having all your texel densities the same. But in this case, it actually would have worked against me because I would have very little resolution on these gauges if you can see how small it made them. And I have also a lot of wasted space up here. So what I did was just make sure to enlarge the shells that are more important. I didn't need this to be that detailed because you're never going to see the bottom. And I also, like I said, wanted these specific gauges to be a little bit larger so I can get more detail on them. Now you can't always do this, it really depends on the model and the project, but it is something that I try to do with my models to take advantage of the space. I try to have as little wasted space as possible because you're only going to get more resolution out of those materials. And finally, the last group is everything else, so the two motors and the back fan and exhaust. Once again, keeping those shells nice and straight so I can fit them nicely together, and I stacked a lot of these together. So all of these blades, for example, are all sharing the same UV space. That way I'm just not wasting unnecessary space because you're never going to see repeating patterns on a blade. That's kind of hidden in there. And another shell I actually made a little bit larger. I wanted to have some text on here. So if I were to make this very small, the texel density equal to everything else, well, the shell would have been much smaller. And if I added text, they would have been a little bit pixelated. So in that situation, I just enlarged it just to fill in empty space that I had. Now there's always room for improvement. The more time you have, the more you can invest into making your UVs look even better. But try to keep those shells nice and straight and try to maximize all that space you have in the 0 to 1 space here. All right, so I did say I created a high and low poly model for this. Now my low poly model, here, I'll turn on the wireframe so you can actually see what it looks like. Now, I first wanted to talk about optimization because that's always extremely important when you're working in video games. And the more time you have to invest in a model, the more optimized you can have it. And usually when you're creating a video game asset, in most cases, you don't have to wrap up everything in one day. In this case, since I'm just doing it on my weekend for this YouTube video, I had to really cut corners in certain areas just to get everything done on time. So today, while I was piecing together the video, I noticed how there's definitely more optimization that I could have done. I cut quite a bit of corners and I thought it'd be important to duplicate this over to show what I should have done if I had more time to invest in it, because I could have definitely cut down the polys even more by quite a bit. So with this model, actually I'll show, let me throw up the poly count. So for this model, I had 71,000 tries. And there's lots of models or lots of objects going on, but as you can see, things like this pipe looks a little bit dense, especially for something that's not too detailed and kind of in the background. We could have cut those polys down quite a bit. Along with stuff like this, I actually left little bevels on here. And to be honest with you, these should be all hard edged. I could have transferred that curvature information from my higher poly mesh onto my lower poly mesh, and then I could have had just a lower poly model to work with. So I quickly just did that on some of the shapes to show you the difference. So on this one, I'm gonna slide this one over. It's the same model, but I actually removed some of the edges, for example, on this, just to show you the difference. So this one is 992 tries, and just by removing a few of those edges, I dropped this one down to 700, and we could have obviously gone even further. And there's more, for example, this back pipe. If you look at these ones, look how lower poly they are compared to this side. These three together are 2096, whereas these three together are 1568. So if I did that to more models on this whole thing, I could have brought those polys down quite drastically. And I just did that just to these specific objects, just to show an example. And just by doing it with these three, I already brought it down from 71,000 to 63,000. So if you really think about if I did that with every object, we could have brought this thing down below 50K. And I think that would be much more realistic for a video game asset. I remember an art director of mine once said, there's always room for more optimization. So I try to keep that in the back of my head. There's always something else you can do, usually, to cut back on polys and make the model more efficient. And of course, that just means investing more time into it. But like I said, I just didn't have much time. So even these two, this one's 2,500 polys, and this one's 16. So it's almost half the size. And I bet you after baking on my high poly mesh, you wouldn't have been able to notice a difference because it would have just baked that curvature into those edges. So just something really important I wanted to talk about because it's crucial for video games and something you should always keep thinking about when you're optimizing your models. So that being said, let's take a look at the high poly mesh. So this high poly one is 222,000 tries. And basically what I did is I took all these meshes and I subdivided them just to create some nice curvature around all these models. So even this one, for example, I just subdivided it to create some nice curvature. So it brings it up to almost 4,000 tries, where my original one was 992. And the main difference actually with this is the bottom piece. So this one, there's not much information going on. And this one, I actually wanted to just create a kind of a bump pattern that I can transfer into my normal map. That way we can use that on my low poly mesh without having to actually have that in the geometry. So like I said, there's always more you can do, but this is just going over quickly how I did it here. So once again, if I just turn this wireframe on, you can see the difference between the two. So at this point, all I have to do is export these two meshes. Of course, add a texture, a material to each of these so I can have a different texture set in Substance Painter. And then we can export our high poly mesh and I can import that into those baking settings later on in Substance Painter. So let me Control Z that. And also it's important to fit your models so they're overlapping each other so it can actually bake or transfer that information properly. So I have my low poly and my high poly. Low-ish poly. Like I said, we could have done more to this. It kind of bugs me. I wish I had more time. I could have done a better job, but time is always working against me, especially on the weekends. So it is what it is. All right, let's export these meshes out. Let's jump over to Substance and we can start our texturing. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in our FBX models. Now, like usual, we always check on that use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, but in this case, we are gonna actually load in our high poly mesh into that little section there. That way we can use both of our models and bake out that information using our high poly mesh. Now, when it came to textures, we are more or less just gonna try to recreate the model from that image I found online from Far Cry 6. So a lot of the colors, a lot of the ideas, I'm just taking directly from this reference. It's basically fan art. We are going to recreate it. There are some things that I actually missed looking back now. There's some really cool like letters on the back motor that I missed, and I feel like that would have been cool to add. And of course, the more time you have to invest in any model, you're going to have better results. But that's just one in particular I wish I could have added, as well as just some of the other roughness values from some of the materials. But like I said, we only had one day to get this done, so we are going to try to get through it as quickly as possible. So when I'm working in Substance Painter and I want to try to get my texturing out really quickly, I'm going to try to take advantage of those smart materials. They are great to use as some sort of base or foundation that you can start working off of. So that's basically what we're going to do. We are going to start throwing on random materials onto these meshes. And then we can start refining them afterwards, start tweaking things, adding fill layers with different grunge values and different dirt values. That way we can have some dirt and grime on top of these materials. But we're not going to worry about that too much at the beginning. We are just going to start filling in those meshes. I always find it's easier to dial in a texture when all the other objects around it have some sort of texture on it. There's times in the past when I've spent just really working on one specific mesh and some texture and I think it's perfect, and then I start adding in other materials around and suddenly it looks off because of all the other materials and colors around it. So what I like to do is just fill in those meshes with some sort of material and then we can start refining them after. Also, don't forget you can find this full texturing process in real time, which will be part of my real-time video that I'm uploading to my Patreon page, and you can find a link to it in the description below. So my goal with this was try to get the texturing done in about an hour to 2 hours tops. I didn't want to spend too long on it since those UVs took a lot longer than I expected them to, so we're going to try to get through this one quickly. So let's not waste any more time talking here. Let's start filling in these meshes with materials and let's slowly texture our hovercraft. All right, and that is everything. That is the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create this hovercraft. Big thanks to Far Cry 6 for inspiring this week's video. There's so much cool art in that game, and like I said, I've been wanting to make this one for a while now, so it was a lot of fun to make. So thank you, Far Cry, for making some really cool art. And also, I want to give a really big shout out to my Patreons. I just can't thank you all enough for your continuous support. It goes such a long way in helping this page. So thank you for supporting my art. I appreciate each and every one of you. And once again, if you want to see this full video in real time, which includes the full UV mapping process, along with all the working files, so if you want to see the Substance Painter file or you just want access to the FBX model, you can find it all on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. Alright, thank you so much for tuning into this week's video. Let me know what you thought about the model in the description below, and I will catch you guys in the next one.